All right, good morning, everyone. So, some of the outcomes we're focusing on for this session is one, understanding DevOps and the differences between that and DevSecOps. And if you're performing rapid innovation on your mission services and you're trying to go down that route, is understanding that while DevOps is a positive move forward, that you're really going to have to get in the frame of DevSecOps to make some true gains. And then we're going to talk a bit about the challenges in that journey that USCIS has had to overcome, as well as seeing the problems from a security practitioner's perspective, especially when dealing with those cultural changes and those technical changes into their systems. Because it's vital from a DevSecOps perspective that you really have to inculcate security ownership throughout the org, and that's vital for that transformation. And then we'll come back and talk a bit about the mechanisms USCIS has put in place to actually achieve that type of rapid change in their organization, as well as a few effective strategies you can go home with. So what is DevOps? Just at a high level, all those cultural changes where you have operations and you have the business units as well as developers all aligned in order to set forth a series of practices and sometimes tooling for a rapid velocity and change into your delivery of services. Part of that is key is making those cultural changes, which Rob's actually going to talk about here in a bit. But before we do, let's talk a bit about the competing forces at play. And of those, we have developers whose job it is to change their environment. They're writing code, they're updating it, they're pushing changes. And then you have operations whose one of their main goals is stability, minimize impact to production, minimize changes to the environment. And then you go on and you introduce security into that mix, who their job now is to make sure both the developers and operations aren't introducing any weaknesses into the environment. Which brings us to DevSecOps, which if you boil it down to sort of 2 points, one is getting security proliferated across the organization, making sure everyone is security owners, and that'll be harped on over and over again. And then the other side is diving deep and putting those security practices and the automation into those workflow and engineering pipelines. Those combinations are vital for success. So with that, let's talk about a bit of the challenges USCIS faced in this journey.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for the quick baseline. So first, I'm from USCIS. I would like to say that just to set the stage for folks that may not know what USCIS is, it is the United States Customs and Immigration Services. And regardless of what you have heard, we do provide the American dream to a lot of people. So I'm actually really proud of the mission. I'm proud to actually work in this organization. And happy to work with a cadre of folks that actually have helped make this talk and essentially our mission a success in actually delivering good quality and secure software for beneficiaries and applicants that are looking for citizenship. So with that said, So Tim has sort of set the stage from an outcomes perspective. I'd like to talk about some of the challenges over the past few years that we have had at USCIS, and we'll get into some of the solutions and the how-tos after we do a little bit of baseline with Tim. But predominantly, a lot of the challenges that we encountered at USCIS sort of started from being in a pretty compliant or hyper-compliant environment, dealing with FISMA, dealing with FedRAMP, ATOs, from a security perspective, but even from a DevOps perspective, a real challenge with sort of siloed out, sort of top-down approach in managing not only the portfolios, managing the delivery of those portfolios to the business and the value to those folks, and sort of a lot of rogue activity or sort of rogue nations that had numerous duplicity across all of the OIT as well as the business. So sort of go back to the origins, from a sort of a DevOps or a continuous integration perspective. I would say like maybe 4 years ago or 5 years ago, the real challenge was just building software in its own right was, again, very stovepipe, very siloed out. And the tools in place were, again, we're going to one build box as opposed to actually having multiple commits to actually do any build at any point in time. And this problem still persists today, is that feedback loop. And how do we actually make those changes or have proper change management in a timely manner? So I think a good example here is when we would make a change, again, a few years ago, in a data center, that change could take up to 6 months. It would have already gone through a battery of tests or what have you. But again, just to actually take that change, give it to a totally different contract team to actually take that deployable code, it could still take up to 6 weeks or more, essentially, to get any feedback as to what this looked like in production. Again, a real siloed out sort of responsibility, duties, and a culture of, again, still kicking things to some other group. And again, being in the government, it'd be great if all the federal staff could actually take the reins and manage this from tip to tail. But we actually deal with a lot of different contractors, and sometimes those contractors don't talk to each other. Sometimes they're competimates, sometimes they're complete competitors. So trying to manage that sort of dichotomy and those challenges just in culture and communication, let alone just getting proper feedback, can be a real challenge. So again, back to sort of what this looks like. How do we sort of manage this? The policies that we had, again, to help sort of promote what I've just described, were we would essentially have release readiness reviews. Those release readiness reviews could last essentially up to 2 days and could essentially end up being sort of stated out for six months. So again, a real gated approach, a real sort of no action, no quick action. And from a sort of a DevOps approach, from a policy perspective, we started to make some shifts in adopting what we called management instructions. And those were not sort of hard level policies. They were enablers to essentially combat or deal with some of these contractual changes and dealing with multiple contractors working together, and not only the development and multiple development teams, but also sort of punting or pushing that code to an operator to actually deliver that code to production. So we actually have 3 of these management instructions that have really been pushing and paving the way from a policy perspective to enable quick, fast, quality code into production. The first one was really just agile, and essentially putting a carrot to all the developers to start to adopt agile practices. And instead of it being a 6-month push, this was more like really a 2-week sort of deployment type of push and focusing on iterative development. The next one, which was instruction number 3, focused on continuous integration and continuous delivery. Predominantly continuous integration, increasing that deployment frequency and having a solid battery of automated tests so that we would have the highest level of confidence in an automated manner that whatever we were pushing to production was great. And it met essentially all the quality checks that these folks managing these release readiness reviews could essentially get that feedback very quick and fast. So these policies really help push the developers. It pushed essentially the supporting characters, quality and such, to essentially start to adopt automation, start to adopt these fast feedback cycles, and start to look at what it means to really deploy with a high level of frequency. To some degree, in some of our portfolios, we're doing 20 plus times a day. So these policies helped, and I guess from a real challenge, we were still leaving security out. So 2 weeks is great, multiple times a day is great, but we were still being hampered from our process perspective, that security would still take a month to 2 months just to do a Fortify scan review. So regardless of the policies we had and the practices we were starting to enable from a DevOps perspective, security was still sort of sucking wind and really holding us back. So again, back to sort of our CI/CD perspective and true DevOps, we've got a bit of an evolution from that we've sort of described already. The management instruction 03 or 02, which really started about continuous integration, the real carrot here for a lot of our dev teams was they would essentially be able to choose their own destiny if they started to adopt some of these practices and start to really adopt DevOps, meaning that if they met certain criteria, they could actually deploy on their own. So this sort of DevOps approach sort of manifested itself as opposed to being all these rogue nation states, and for sort of an immature area across all these different contracting teams, all these different portfolios managed by different federal staff, we started to aggregate and mature the way we were moving forward with DevOps. Some of those practices were aggregating on a common distributed source code repository tool, as well as starting to aggregate on common platforms, like an orchestration tool to manage a lot of our automation. Again, one of our problems, not only from a process perspective, not only from a policy perspective, we discovered that security just, they continued to be at the end of any conversation. The security folks, unfortunately, still had a mindset of omnipresent and sort of master of the universe, or MOTU, where they were the finger waggers or the finger pointers. So some of these challenges really enable that bolt-on or non-baked-in approach from security. As we move through this pipeline, standing up our infrastructure, running all of our battery of automated tests, getting great quality scores, we still had security coming down on us, not only on our infrastructure that may or may not be rogue from an AWS perspective or an Omni perspective, had different hardening sets or different STIG levels, to the fact that just trying to scan that environment or scan that code was still very lengthy and always essentially at the end. And there was no empowerment from a developer to actually do any of this work themselves. Security still had a tight rein on how they wanted to move forward, how they wanted to review and look at the code, how they wanted to assess that environment. So no baked-in approach from a security perspective. So what we started to do was, as we started a few new projects, specifically one project in mind, we actually started to build out a Kubernetes platform. And as we move forward from sort of theoretical to boots on the ground and actually starting to do some coding, at the onset we put together a team that included essentially the quality folks, the automated testing folks, the infrastructure engineering folks, as well as the networking folks. And this was probably one of the first times we actually included, because they were available, security engineers that could actually start to build out some of our CloudFormation templates, that could actually start to integrate some of the Fortify scans directly into the infrastructure code that we were pushing through our pipeline. So this provided, again, that perspective that was completely missing, as well as the skill set that had never been present, to actually make this Kubernetes platform a success. So this was sort of our first foray into sort of our DevSecOps approach. That sort of gated challenge was at the end, or being bolted on at the end, having that security individual embedded with us, starting to open up those tools so that we could start to embed those into the pipeline, made it for a world of difference, and made it so that we, trying to just push something across the goal line, could be done without a 6-month Fortify scan review. And we'll get into here in a little bit some of the hows and sort of the tactical approach to make this happen. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim to sort of give us a real security standpoint and set the infrastructure, or set the foundation for the hows.
Thanks, Rob. So it's important to start looking at these technical and cultural shifts from a security perspective, because developers, operation teams, business units need to understand what those fears are, what can be actualized, and what needs to be done from a shared ownership perspective. So we'll start a little bit with our blind spots, because we can't secure what we have no visibility in, what we don't know is there. We have issues with that, correct? And that's always a fear, especially when you start doing an automation where security is standing on the outside of it. And one of those blind spots are pulling from disparate sources. And that's pulling everything from how your code is submitted, where your data resides, commercial software, open source software, all these elements that go into actually what touches your systems and your data. And one of the things that you can commonly see is the vast use of open source software, and you're pulling packages and libraries down, is that a lot of times those are being pulled down as compiled binaries and then trying to deal with those issues, when a better option is pulling down source, putting those through your engineering pipelines and your workflows the same way you do with any code that you do in-house. It's key at this point, as you can see, why you start baking in engineering resources from security teams early on to start actually understanding those early processes when it comes to those mechanisms. One of the other blind spots are a lack of rigor when managing large and complex systems. You can't possibly manage an enterprise operation in a manual way and achieve the same consistency over and over again. Automation is vital in order to do that. And if you have to be carefully plan out execution of that, but you need to take a good look at that from a blind spot perspective of how you're operating and managing from a complex nature. And the other thing is, how many of you have good visibility in knowing what is a manual effort and what is not? Like, do you even understand and know from a vast view of the enterprise and your portfolio systems what's being done at the boots on the ground level from a manual perspective versus an automated, and where you need to close those gaps? And another blind spot is around scaling. And scaling can mean many things. We can talk about scaling from a scaling up perspective, compute, storage, bandwidth, to deal with something like a distributed denial of service attack, which, even if you have scrubbing services, network mitigations, a targeted one can impact you heavily. And one of the keys there is contemplating that beforehand and architecting your workload to account for being able to scale up at those capacity spikes. Another reason to be able to pump in automation and take those scarce security engineering resources and come back and look at it from an architectural standpoint. Like, let them focus on things that are high priority issues where judgment is key, such as system design. Another aspect of scaling is scaling down, right? So from a security perspective, it's hard to compromise a system that doesn't exist. So being able to scale down resources and remove them automatically is a huge boon for security. And then one of the final aspects of scaling is speed, right? So traditionally, security has slowed down speed. A lot of times in the past, we did it because we needed to maintain quality. We function as security and risk management. And a lot of that is very much quality assurance, where you're actually doing security reviews, system reviews, all these things that in order to maintain a certain level of quality, you ended up in the past having to slow down and perform manually. Well, now it's the time to start looking at those, what can be automated, what takes actual human judgment versus something you can do through a machine. What are things that you can now take advantage of more novel technologies around machine learning. But let me also note that one of the big pieces on scaling and systems is that from a security perspective and security systems, those have to be able to scale as well. And that's one thing that sometimes proper planning is not done at, right? So if your mission workload is scaling to meet some high demand that's critical but the controls around that workload don't scale with it, you're going to be in for a bad day, bad week, bad month, what have you. So your security systems and the controls around those workloads have to scale with it. And by security systems, I also mean processes, procedures, the policies you write, the training that you do. All of those have to be looked at in a scalable fashion in order to basically spread the ownership and security responsibility across the org. Now, because we have all these disparate sources that are coming into play for forming things, and because we may lack the rigor that we know we need in security protections, and that humans can't, in a manual sense, have that consistency around scaling and speed, then one of the overarching things we need to start looking at is getting humans away from the data. And by that, I don't just mean direct interaction with it. I mean, get them away from the systems that support it, getting them away from the overall management systems, the security systems. If these systems are so critical, why do we allow direct access unfettered all the time? Right? That's something you need to carefully look at. We know that there is a particular comfort level with having shell access, for example, but is it really needed? And if it is vitally needed in a break glass kind of way, is it instrumented? Are you taking metrics on it? Are you doing quorum-based approvals? Right? Look at ways to minimize that contact with what's vital to your systems and to your mission. And one of the best ways to get people away from the data is automation. And one of the best practices we have in automation currently is continuous delivery pipelines. So this is just a notional one that you can see, but what's vital here is understanding security's role in breaking that into every sort of phase of this pipeline. And in reality, you would see this pipeline with many feedback loops at each phase. But even down to the initial concept of source control, understanding who's committing their access rights to source, knowing that that just doesn't apply to developers anymore. For folks that are starting to move into the infrastructure as code practices, that means operations who are doing coding now should be pushing their elements and those practices through the pipeline. And so the controls are very critical on that. You treat it all the same, and then if you're doing delivery to production, they all go through the same pipeline, whether they're ops folks, whether they are developers, and in some cases, whether they're security and they're building out security resources and tests. The other part is the build phase, right? So that's where you're going to create your artifacts that would further go down the pipeline, whether it's compiling code to binaries, packaging up scripts, when configuration data. So the same things apply here, and this is a good part to start doing some things like static code analysis. Things that as those things are building, you can do those checks, break the build, initiate the feedback loop, and come back in. And then testing and staging is a key area for really accelerating security assurance. Because at that point, you can not only do discrete tests on the workload systems, the code itself, you can also associate it with the platforms that it'll operate on and handling those tests holistically and seeing what the impact is to your environment. All of this with the cloud, you're able to scale these up at an infrastructure level very quickly, so now you can replicate what the actual impact would be to your environment. And again, that would encase many feedback loops in order to do the continuous improvement around things that might queue off an alarm. And then production, which traditionally was throw over to the wall, give it to ops, give them some set of procedures, some package of scripts where they go in and manually sometimes log in and update the system, deploy the code. If you're lucky, they would use some type of enterprise system to hopefully do it to somewhat at scale. But a lot of times that meant operations had to have privileged access to the systems in order to do this. Again, that's something that we want to start removing. Why is it necessary? If we can do it through the pipeline and do it from a standpoint of that pipeline has the permission and not the person, we can start removing that access rights, those critical components where they have sensitive access to that data. And that's key. That's something from AWS perspective we've worked on heavily is being able to remove any access capability on the shell, right? So that's very key, is understanding what to do. And in cases where it's still not viable to remove that, again, is looking at how you can instrument a safe way to do it. Because there's no reason that you couldn't look at customizing shells, for example, in order to do that. And then finally, the maintain phase, right? So not everyone can build a 12-factor immutable app that's changed, the instances are changed every few hours. The realization is there's going to be some long-lived systems. But the automation key in those systems, you can use the same type of automated workflows and delivery with a long-lived system that you do with short-lived if you sit down and plan for it right, which is another reason by building the automation into these workflows and pipelines allows you now to take a security resource who is bogged down with, let's say, doing updates, or an operations engineer that was repeating the same task over and over all night long trying to do an update. Now they can actually stretch their muscles and do some real skill work and looking at how to put those protections in place. So now you actually have somebody that's, from a cultural standpoint, has actually more skin in the game. They're doing something that's more leaning forward and probably having some better satisfaction than doing a repetitive task. If you have a repetitive task, if you do it more than 2 times, look at how it can be automated. So, how does USCIS implemented some of these mechanisms?
Thanks, Tim. So, again, I left off by sort of talking about breaking down that barrier with security. Again, moving from a master of the universe sort of mentality or omnipresent finger-wagging mentality, and actually inviting them to actually join us in our projects at the onset was, and as well ensuring that the people we invited had the right skill set was probably paramount to breaking down this barrier. And then constantly establishing, at least at USCIS and with the teams that we worked with, I think one of the most important components was, and you've heard this sort of language before, but having that empathy, understanding what security is, taking responsibility, or at least illustrating that you're taking responsibility, and having that shared responsibility mindset, as well as providing to the security folks that you're providing them a level of confidence that you know what the hell you're doing. Having sort of moving forward in that sort of perspective helps a lot in sort of breaking down this barrier. A lot of these security folks, sorry for the security guys in the room, but they do have that master of the universe complex. And we're finding that as security folks are sort of being more embedded into our teams, they're actually becoming a little more humble. They're actually starting to understand and have empathy for the actual engineers, not only on the operations side, but also on the development side. So this, again, manifested itself at USCIS by a tight coupling and good relationships with those security engineers, as well as the management of security, illustrating the benefit and value of moving forward. So again, as we move forward and as we started to build these teams, just like infrastructure as code, just like essentially quality as code, as we've already talked about, we started to really move forward with essentially having security as code. Why not? And sort of some of this has to do with tooling. A lot of the tooling 4 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, didn't really enable any sort of security as code. Fortify still kind of doesn't. But as we've actually adopted some pretty good tools that actually present APIs for the engineers, infrastructure, the actual development team, they can actually now start to take a level of ownership and actually start to program to these tools and then start to include them in their CI/CD processes. The other component, as we worked with security as code and sort of the developers or the DevOps teams at USCIS, was we started to actually build out building blocks that we could leverage across all of USCIS. And right now we're even having talks of starting to leverage these building blocks across all of DHS. What does that mean, a building block? So within AWS, everybody I'm sure is familiar with Inami. So we actually, from code and using STIG and CIS level 2 hardening requirements, actually have a pipeline just for building out secure hardened OSs that could be leveraged by any other development team that has proper change management, proper version control, as well as has its own pipeline that can be, again, reused over and over again. So that was one of the first sort of security as code implementations that we moved forward with in AWS that we do leverage extensively. So that sort of manifested itself into its own sort of little mini marketplace for USCIS. So from an automated processes perspective, I mean, this sort of sets the stage for leveraging, again, some of these tools. And where do these security tools start to fit into? Very similar to quality in a CI/CD perspective, security kind of isn't any different, really, because I want to have good quality code. I want to have good secure code and have a good secure infrastructure as well that it sits on. Integrating some of these automated processes into our CI/CD pipeline essentially tackled a lot of some of the challenges we've had. Again, leveraging the right tools, where they fit in, from static code analysis all the way to actually doing Nessus scans in the end state from a lower environment to a higher environment, and ensuring that essentially we did have like environments without snowflakes. So how do we really make this happen? I sort of brought this up a little bit, but one of our, at USCIS anyways, one of our sort of core tenets is essentially empowering engineers, empowering developers, DevOps teams, now DevSecOps teams, to leverage the tools that they need to do their job and not have some other group or sort of division or what have you to essentially be a blocker. Having these sort of platforms or PaaS tools, having the ability to actually programmatically access these tools and build them into your pipeline has actually produced this MO or culture of full self-service. Not to say there isn't an underlying team that does support these tools. These tools are presented in a multi-tenant fashion, which provide accessibility for all these other teams. So culturally, now we've actually empowered our dev or DevSecOps teams to do the job they need to do to get the feedback that they need that does match up to some of our automated policies that we have in place.
Hey, Rob, how has this affected your ability to achieve an ATO?
So from going from a static sort of an ATO perspective where we do essentially a review, whatever, maybe every 6 months or once a year, we've now adopted essentially ongoing authorization, leveraging these tool sets. At any point in time, we actually have it's not a snapshot, it's just essentially a revolving door that any sort of security assessment team or a C&E team could come in and review that pipeline and the artifacts of that pipeline based upon that, essentially tracing it all the way back to either a dev commit tag, even an infrastructure pipeline tag, and now to the security tooling tags that are embedded in those pipelines. So with ongoing authorization, these processes, as well as the tools and the culture, have actually enabled this to happen. So leveraging sort of a shared responsibility as well from taking the AWS components and then building upon top of that essentially a PaaS or a KA perspective where essentially we're delivering these already hardened AMIs or hardened Docker images. Now what we need to worry about really is a small subset of controls that could be 20 to 30 as opposed to hundreds. So the sort of the level of effort to achieve an ATO and then maintain that LOE moving forward has reduced dramatically. And then again, the amount of people that need to be a part of that process reduced dramatically as well. And it also provides our CISO and our ISOs essentially a dashboard with the ability to, again, at any point in time, see what change has occurred, where it occurred, what it affected, what tools were in place to make it, to validate that change based upon any commit. It's pretty slick. So I think the underlying theme here is sort of codification or codification. And we've talked a lot about CI/CD and pipelines and what have you. Really, not only security and embedding, making security code, but ensuring that the pipelines that we've just discussed are code as well. Not only from installation configuration, which we've got a little bit of a blurb here, and embedding your pipeline as code that, again, is under proper change management, proper version control, and then can be reused and vetted by any other team within the organization. So at USCIS, we have a pretty good group of DevSecOps engineers, and to help enhance sort of that adoption, that onboarding of new contractors and new teams, not only to the platforms that we've got, but also just to provide that structure from a pipeline, we've actually provided templatized and parameterized Jenkins files for these teams to essentially enter in their endpoints and then essentially start doing commits by putting, in this case, a Jenkins file into their repository that actually is integrated with something like a Jenkins orchestration tool. So having that parameterized script, again, provides the capability for quick onboarding, illustrates essentially all the tools that they can manage in that pipeline. And from an enterprise perspective, we actually now have a good visibility, a good picture from an ISO, CISO, developer, operations, security engineer to actually understand what is at play and what's in flight at any point in time. So at USCIS, sort of talked about parameterized. I wanted to at least show you a little bit of the workflow that we have in place. Some of this is modified, has been modified or upgraded. But a lot of work has gone into essentially integrating a lot of these tools, a lot of these processes, so that we have end-to-end repeatable CI/CD processes that can be used not only for an application, but they can also be used for infrastructure. Even in developing a new AMI or moving forward with a new CentOS release. So all of these systems, all of these tools, help provide us that capability of shifting security or embedding security into our processes and shifting it essentially all the way as far to the left as possible. So no more baited approach, no more waiting to the end, no more bolt-on. Security is, they have a seat at the table. They actually are playing and participating and actually even engineering the code, the applications, the supporting infrastructure to make sure that we are delivering good, secure, quality applications. So as we've moved forward, some of our sort of next steps is it's great to have a pipeline, but I want us to continue to think about shifting security and quality right to the developer. So we at USCIS are starting to embed security tools right into the actual IDEs. We're actually embedding pre-commit hooks where it's looking for secrets or looking for PII, looking for any of these sorts of things that that may provide or be a vulnerability to any of the applications or the infrastructure moving forward. So we're continuing to push these things, trying to standardize these tools and these practices right down to the developer or the DevSecOps teams. I think that to me is really where we can be the most efficient, as well as providing that feedback to that team and then ultimately to the entire organization. So we have almost an organizational continuous improvement feedback loop as it relates to security. So Tim, I'm going to let you take us home and we can comment on together on our strategies.
That's right. All right. So some things, key takeaways. One is becoming customer obsessed. And this a lot of times means for the public sector arena becoming mission obsessed. And that needs to be all the way from the security side to the business owners, to the developers, operations, it's vital, right? So from a security perspective, you've got to think about, if somebody comes to me with an ask, instead of saying no, it's how can I help them accomplish this, right? Even if it's something that seems risky, really take an analytical view of it, determine if it's too risky, is there an alternate path to doing this? But stay mission focused. And then organizing around small teams that are focused on outcomes and not activities, right? The problem with focusing on activities so many times is all those build to an outcome, and with too many teams siloed focusing on activities, by the time you get to the outcome, it's usually not the one you wanted, or it's delayed, or it takes forever. By having a team own the entire outcome, then they can actually have a lot of flexibility in how they achieve it, as well as they have the innate ability to function and deliver all the way through. So you're not having to split it up into activities. And then the other part is start small. Don't try to boil the ocean. Be strategic, and then look at tactically where you can actually implement things, have success, grow that success, or have failure and be able to fail fast and use that as continuous improvement. Any?
I just state, as we've moved forward in our first foray into sort of a DevSecOps team, this team sort of mimicked a AWS pizza team. It was small. It started as a war room style effort that was essentially covered in whiteboards, and it was pretty grueling. But that team was small, and we were essentially obsessed with producing a product that we actually already had metrics that we wanted to start to measure against. So again, we did start small. We started with sort of single focused and continued to iterate on what essentially the features would be from that product. So absolutely.
Excellent. So one of the things you can do immediately is start by baselining your environment, right? Know what you have. And by this, I mean in a multi-dimensional fashion, right? Who has the access rights? What are the runtime calls? What's the execution patterns? What are the dependencies? You need to know all these things if you want to be able to actually benchmark it and show progress, or decouple it, decompose it if you want to look at microservices. Like, you have to know your environment innately. And one of the other things is letting builders build is vital in order to innovate. And for that, you need security to have a seat at the table. Invite them in so that you can actually work together. And I'll tell the security practitioners out there, if you get a seat at the table, don't have your default response be no. Work with them. Try to figure out a way to get the mission done. An example of this from an AppSec team aspect is, well, first let me say, one of the things we're starting to see in order to achieve this is security organizations hiring developers, and those developers automating those security practices and freeing up those security engineers to actually be at the table and do depth design reviews, in our case, AppSec reviews. But then always have feedback loops, constant ones, right? So not just whether if there's an issue with the code, but also how is the interaction, right? We do qualitative type of things where if the interaction with the security engineer was poor or okay, we take that survey and we survey everything. Every time we have this engagement, we have thousands of them a year. We take that and we deep dive into why the interaction wasn't great, and we improve on it and go again. Like, you have to enjoy interacting with security too, right? The relationship has to be there. And then finally, some things that you can try immediately, which is understand your SDLC, right? You want to know it, embed folks in it, embed security engineers in it, have a full understanding, as Rob was saying, tip to tail of the workflow.
Think about supply chain management. Think about those dependencies that are injected into your entire tip to tail. There's plenty of good processes, plenty of good tools, a lot of open source out there that you can actually reuse to understand what that supply chain is, from external repositories down to essentially where they live throughout any of your environments.
Right, and I'll just hit because we're running low on time, just a couple other of these. One that's important is documenting every instance of human interaction. You should be able to do that. If you don't know if humans are interacting with your systems now or the data, that's not a good spot to be in, so I highly advise make that a priority. Know under what circumstances people have to do things and get access and touch things. You want to be able to get your hand around that because you can't drive reduction of access, automation, all those things unless you know how folks are actually working with the systems.
I would say the last one, Tim, a good one is the very last one here. Set a goal to deploy your workloads from your source code. If you can do essentially source to image type of methodology, highly encourage it. You'll understand where your weaknesses are very, very quickly. And it's a good practice just in general to try and start to adopt.
All right, so we have just a couple minutes for questions, but Rob and I will be here afterwards a bit. And please fill out your surveys. All right?
Thank you.